there's so many ways to address this, like why has the press done such, up until recently, a poor job, in my view. I'm going to lay out, I'm working on an article now for the review about the coverage of Iraq leading up to the election and how it's interacting with the election. So I thought I'd share some of my thoughts on that with you, and then we can get into elements of the broader discussion when we go back and forth. It seems to me that watching and reading the news over the past couple months that the election really is going to turn in part on this one key question, which is how events in Iraq are interpreted. Are they helping to fight the war on terrorism, as President Bush is claiming, or are they a distraction, as Senator Kerry is saying? And it's interesting to see how Bush and his supporters are basically doing everything they can to make sure that the news on Iraq fits their particular framework. Because they realize how critically they're being formed by the news coming out of Iraq. So let me just cite one example that I think is very revealing in this regard, and it involves the Wall Street Journal and this email that got sent out by their reporter, Farnaz Fasihi, a few weeks ago. A number of you, I'm sure, have heard about this or even read it on the internet, where it got quite a bit of attention. Very vivid email describing what it was like for her as a reporter who has been in Iraq, in Baghdad, for a long time, how bad things have gotten. She talked about how journalists not only cannot leave Baghdad, they can barely leave their hotel. The dangers are so great, fear of kidnapping, a number of her colleagues who'd been kidnapped, just the hostility from the Iraqi people in general, and how this reflected on the overall situation, not just for reporters, not just for Americans and other foreigners, but for Iraqis in general. She captured this so vividly that it created a sensation. And in a way, it's revealing that it took this personal email, which she sent to 40 friends, to really break through the sort of scrim of conventional reporting. I mean, there's been so much bad news out of Iraq, and yet there was something about this email that didn't even appear in the newspaper that captured people. She was speaking from the heart, and she had more freedom to write it than she would in her news accounts. And it's interesting that since this appeared, all these other journalists at the New York Times, the LA Times, Washington Post have written their versions of her email that have now appeared in newspapers. And it's just extraordinary that this hadn't appeared before, this sort of bringing home just how bad things have gotten. As it happens, Ms. Fasihi, in the course of writing this, also, because it was meant to be a personal message, called the Bush policy a disaster. She was very upfront about this. And this added to the sensation, and particularly among conservatives who are always monitoring the media to see if, in fact, it confirms their suspicions that the media are liberal. And there was such a huge outcry and demands for her head, so to speak, that the Journal, in a sort of Solomonic decision, said that the reporter had vacation time due her, and so she was going to take the vacation time, and it so happens that the vacation time was going to go past the election. So she was not going to be reporting from there. Now, and the Journal has not, in fact, as far as I know, because I've been talking to journalists over there, sent anyone back in to replace her. Now, I don't fault the Journal for this. As Ms. Fasihi said, it is so dangerous there now. It's so difficult for journalists that they are in fact making a prudent decision in a way to not send people over there. Although Mark himself might be going next month, he told me.
Going back?
Going back, yes. From his visit last year. But I'll let him
Bob isn't quite as prudent as a lot of the other editors.
But here's the thing. The proof is always in the pudding. So what is it? Did the Journal pull her out because of safety reasons? Overwhelmingly that, or were they somehow buckling to this tide of criticism? So the proof is in the pudding. I've looked at the Journal coverage since she left sometime in the latter part of September, and it's just extraordinary. Basically, the Iraq story has fallen away for the paper. There have been so few front page stories from there, and you don't have to be there to write good Iraq stories. I'm going to get into that in a minute, but I am just, basically, the Iraq story, the Journal has neutered that story, I believe. The conservative protests have succeeded in neutering the Journal as a major source of information on Iraq. Meanwhile, the editorial page is booming away every day. Kerry, flip-flopper, Iraq, the news is better than you expect. And it's the vacuum on the news side has allowed the editorial page to amplify its voice. And I read one columnist, Daniel Henninger, who's one of the people who thinks everything over there is just going swimmingly, and he said, you know, with this sort of sneer that, the press is saying everything's so bad, but anybody who really wants to find out what's going on over there can look at these Iraqi websites, people over there who are putting out first-hand accounts. So I actually looked up one of them, and it turns out it was written by a dentist who was based in Basra, and he said, I'm sorry that I haven't filed in a while. Part of it's I've just moved from Basra to Baghdad, but also things have gotten so bad here that these two pharmacists who had been giving medication to people linked to the United States, there was a raid on their pharmacy, they were abducted, and their headless bodies were found within a day. The level of disingenuousness that he's putting this forward as a source of information, nobody's going to look it up. It was just so heartrending to read this poor man sitting there and what had happened to these pharmacists. You could just feel the chill in the air from reading this site. I'm not going to go into all the ways, I've been talking to journalists, the ways that the Bush administration has been trying to manage the news over there. I mean, the journalists, if they go on these embeds and they write something critical that the U.S. military doesn't like, they just shut down. You can't get on another embed. They won't answer. One journalist was complaining they won't answer her emails anymore because they didn't like what was written. We were talking yesterday in Los Angeles that somebody asked about whether they're anything equivalent to the 5 o'clock follies in Vietnam, and there's nothing. Journalists would be desperate to have 5 o'clock follies now to go to in Baghdad. Talk about the Journal, but TV, of course, is the major place that Americans are getting their news. And in this regard, really, President has a major weapon in Fox News. I'm not saying anything new for this audience here, I think. But I don't know, how many of you saw this documentary Outfoxed, which is really an attack on Fox News? Yeah, I'm sure many of you have. I saw it. I have to say I was initially a bit skeptical about it because it's cut in such a way that they just had one snippet after another making Fox look terrible. And I thought, you know, it can't really be quite like this. I felt they were doing the greatest or the worst hits of Fox. But I've been watching it now, and it really is not an exaggeration. I have just been so struck by the pervasiveness of the bias in Fox. And it's not just, you know, often you see it in the way guests get selected on talk shows, who's asked on. And after one of the debates, the panel was Britt Hume, Bill Kristol, Fred Barnes, and Mort Kondracki. So I'm not sure even who is supposed to be the token moderate on that one. But in the news coverage as well, it's just extraordinary how much there is. Sometimes it's blatant. Sometimes you really have to be watching closely. For instance, this subliminal example where whenever news on Iraq comes on, the rubric it's shown under is War on Terror. So this is perfectly fitting the whole Bush approach, that events in Iraq are part of fighting the war on terror. And to cite an example that my fellow panelists heard me say yesterday, this anchor had an interview with Prime Minister Alawi of Iraq, and she asked him these various questions, and it was a decent interview. But afterwards, she had two people on to talk about it, and their first question was, is this not one of the most courageous people on the face of the earth right now? And the two men, one of whom was a former military officer and the other, I'm not even sure, heartily agreed. There was no dispute, there was no distance between them on that question. CNN, I think, is where, in a way, the battle for the heart and soul of the media during this election is occurring, because this once proud network has, I think, become progressively eviscerated. And you see the Fox effect there. You see the fear of their appearing to being accused of being liberal, being like Dan Rather and part of the liberal media. And they just seem to be going out of their way to avoid that charge. Brent Sadler, who's been doing their stand-ups every hour from Baghdad, I mean, the use of terms like precision bombing and terrorist strongholds, taking U.S. statements and just becoming a relayer bell for them without the most basic journalistic type of skepticism or qualifiers added. And Wolf Blitzer, I'm giving you some examples that I've written down in the course of the last couple months. I mean, he was talking to General George Jalwan about the recent offenses the U.S. military has been undertaking, and he said, Muslims don't understand that over the last 15 years, the U.S. has gone to war in Kuwait, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan to help Muslims. We need to understand that, as do our Muslim friends. This was an anchor just opining in the middle of an interview with a former commander, U.S. commander, who, again, completely partisan in terms of, he's not going to give you an independent assessment of what the U.S. military is doing over there. I'm not going to get into a discussion about the reasons for this. My book does to some degree, and we can talk about it, but I think the 9/11 effect is just critical. The fear of appearing anti-patriotic is something that any journalist who's going to be honest with you, who has friends who's gotten thousands of emails condemning them and their family for something they've written, can talk about the intimidating effect of this. Now, just to move toward my conclusion, let me talk about the other type of good reporting that we've been seeing. Orville, in his preface to my book, talks about the fact that we now have this two-tier media. On the one hand, sort of cable news and things allied to it, which are very popular-oriented, market-driven, and sort of are giving us more news about Scott Peterson than about what's going on in Iraq. And then the sort of more elite or quality tier, which of course is our major daily newspapers, and NPR and the Lair NewsHour and so on. And while the Wall Street Journal has, in my view, been neutered, as I was describing, I think the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times have really been doing excellent work of late. Of course, if you have a different perspective from me, you're going to say they've been too liberal and too anti-Bush and so on. But from my view, they are really doing some extraordinary reporting on the mess over there. And we were just talking about this. I don't know how many of you have been watching TV today, but the story the New York Times had in today's paper about the 300-plus pounds of this highly tons of this highly destructive explosives. It's been all over the news, and it strikes me as interesting. Is the anticipated October surprise going to be the New York Times coming out with a story which is just so far has many Republicans on the defensive? I do think the New York Times is doing penance for its earlier failure. My book singles them out for their coverage in the lead up to the war. I think it was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of American reporting since Vietnam. I think the Times was not the only offender, as I try to show. There was a general sort of failure of the media to bring the proper scrutiny to the claims of the Bush administration lead up to the war. But the Times went out of its way. It was not merely sort of a conveyor belt or doing stenography. It went and found information that it claimed was evidence of of Iraq's quest for nuclear weapons, and it really gave the Bush administration added ammunition to make its case. Still, there are many problems in this elite tier, I think, and I think our discussion will probably get into some of that. But there is, I find the press strangely blinkered. Day-to-day reporting on the mess has been good, and this explosive story is also good digging. But just analysis of events going on there, there's this sort of I've written in my book about just a lack of knowledge of Arabic. I mean, this is such a basic thing. We would not send reporters to Russia or China without knowing Russian or Chinese. But Anthony Shadid of the Washington Post is known by everybody and toasted because he knows Arabic. He's almost a singular case over there. And how can you follow what Al Jazeera is saying? How can you read the Iraqi newspapers? There are many that have flourished. You don't know the language. How are you going to really know what people are breathing? The story of these U.S. military offensives. What are they going to, what chance do they have of succeeding? The civilian casualties are always being downplayed in these stories. They're not being downplayed on Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya. They're having a huge effect in the Arab world, in Iraq and the Arab world in generally. They are pushing together. Another thing is, who are the insurgents? There's this basic division of the foreign fighters, the jihadis, the Zarqawis, and then the more Iraqi nationalist forces that there's a tension between these groups. And many people think that the attacks on Fallujah and Samarra and Ramadi are in fact driving these forces together. One correspondent was telling me the U.S. has to have a strategy to hive off these nationalists from the jihadis because they are foreigners and a lot of Iraqis are upset with what they're doing. I just find very little analysis of all this. The one person who is single-handedly beating these even the A-tier, Juan Cole, he has a website called Informed Comment. He knows Arabic, Persian, Urdu. He's written a book on Shia Islam. If you go to his website, you find analysis of the ins and outs and the shifting agendas and alliances of the different religious groups and tribal groups in Iraq in a way that none of the huge press corps that our newspapers have are able to do.
I agree with just about everything my colleague just said. It seems to me the extraordinary thing is we are sitting here 8 days before the election, in which the central issue is a war that was begun to confront a threat posed by weapons of mass destruction, and that was thought to be a war that was advertised to be a short war, a war that would begin with shock and awe, and that would end a couple of months later with the withdrawal of all but a token force of American troops. So we saw very clearly the reason for the war, the weapons of mass destruction, which, as Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld said at the time, we know where they are in Tikrit and other places. We knew the war would be a cakewalk, as Ken Edelman and others called it before the war, and we knew what the ending would look like. That is, the regime would collapse, Ahmed Shalabi and others would take the place of the Iraqi leadership of Saddam Hussein and others, and the Americans would be able to leave rather quickly. And we've seen over the last year and a half a remarkable transformation, a metamorphosis, in which, first of all, the beginning of the war became less and less clear until at the moment we as citizens have very little idea why the war was actually fought. The rationale that we had heard again and again from all of our highest officials has been decisively refuted by a government report that was released a couple of weeks ago, and that got relatively little publicity because the news that it conveyed, finally with some authority, had already been known to Americans for many months. Now, the beginning became obscure, and the end, of course, has receded far into the distance. We don't know what the end will be. So we don't know why Americans are there. We don't know how long they will be there. And as Michael has just described, most Americans have very little idea why, or in what way, how the war is being fought. Meanwhile, we have an election in 8 days, and the war is a major issue. I've had the feeling over the last couple of months, and especially over the last few weeks, that we have a set of facts racing to catch up to the American people. And the question is, will those facts, it's like a swarm of hornets or something, and Americans are running ahead of them. Will those facts be able to catch up to Americans before November 2nd? I wrote in a piece in the New York Review, the current one that's out, in Bob's symposium on the election and the future. I began it by saying, or by writing, it's been clear for many months that America is losing its war in Iraq, What is yet to be seen is whether Americans will recognize this fact before the election or after it. And this set of circumstances means that the press and the questions we're considering tonight is absolutely central. It's not a matter of the journalism school, it's a matter of our politics and the future of the country. As I said, I agree with much of what Michael said about the reporting of the war. I think the war itself, the embedding, was rather a disaster, and Americans saw very little of what the war actually consisted of, including very little death, almost no death, as a matter of fact. I remember very well the television coverage in which you mostly saw military vehicles moving and explosions in the distance. And indeed, television viewers in England, and especially on the continent of Europe, saw much more of the carnage, the actual death, and the actual destruction that was the first month of the war. And without having a vision of what the war actually was, it's very difficult to understand Iraqis' attitudes toward Americans. Without knowing that somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Iraqis have died in this war thus far, it's very hard to understand the politics there. And that fact appears almost nowhere in the American press. I guess where I'm going to diverge a moment from what Michael was arguing, though, is I want to make an argument that we're in a particularly peculiar time, not because of what the press does and doesn't do, but even though I agree with many of those points, but more because of the strange political situation we find ourselves in. That is, we're living, in effect, under a one-party government. The Republican Party controls the presidency, obviously, the Congress, the courts. So this has given us a strange situation in which we're living with a series of scandals that have indeed been revealed largely in the press, but once they have been revealed, very little is done about them, which constitutes a kind of ongoing corruption of the body politic that I think can only be ended with a change of administrations. Many of you, I'm sure, saw the front page story in the New York Times today about the weapons depot, which, as Michael mentioned, contained several hundred tons of very high explosive, very sophisticated explosives that are particularly loved by terrorists because they're very stable. They don't just explode. They need a blasting cap. They're the best kinds of explosives. They disappeared. The depot wasn't guarded, although before the war it had been by the International Atomic Energy Agency. It was internationally guarded, as was Iraq's nuclear plant at Hiawatha. When the Americans came in, neither of those sites were guarded. It's fantastic and amazing to realize that yellow cake that was in the possession, it was in this Iraqi plant, was being controlled by international officials, was actually looted under the eyes of the American occupation, as were these explosives that Michael mentioned. Now, I want to point to that piece because it fascinates me. It's a very big story. How many of you read it today in the Times? How many of you heard about it on television? It's been percolating through the cable stations. And the reason it's fascinating to me is because when I was in Iraq about a year ago, a little less than that, it was an open secret in the country, and it had been reported in the American press, that vast numbers of arms depots were simply unguarded. You could get in your pickup truck, drive outside of town, drive up to one of these places, some of which are the size of 5 or 6 football fields, put the gate of the truck down and fill it up with explosives. No one was guarding them. And indeed, people have been doing this all around the country, and they've been doing it ever since the Americans entered Iraq. This story has appeared before in the press, but what was it that gave it escape velocity today? Why was it today it became a scandal? And why wasn't it a scandal before? Let me leave that question lying there for a moment and take up the subject of this book, which the New York Review is bringing out. It's called Torture and Truth. There's an image on the cover, which I suppose few of you can see, of so-called hooded man. This is the figure that became so famous 6 months ago when CBS News broadcast the photographs from Abu Ghraib. It was a man who a hood was put over his head, wires were attached to his fingers and to his genitals. He was placed on a box and told that if he moved, he would be electrocuted. And it was a way to stress him out, as the military policeman who was convicted of this last week told the judge. This military policeman, this was a story that appeared on A12 of the New York Times, stood before the judge and explained that the intelligence officer in the prison in Abu Ghraib had told him that he wanted this guy softened up and stressed out, and the military policeman said, well, what should I do exactly? And according to the military policeman's statement, he was told he could do anything he wanted as long as he didn't kill him. Now, this man was sentenced a few days ago to 8 years in prison. He pled guilty. In the same piece, in the third paragraph in the New York Times piece, we read of a 26-year-old Afghan who died in American detention the same day, 26 years old. There was no explanation for how he died, simply the note that an investigation had been begun and that it didn't seem to appear to be connected to any health problem he had before he entered American detention. Somewhere between 40 and 50 Iraqis and Afghanis have died in American custody under interrogation. The Schlesinger report, which came out over the summer, identified 5 who had been killed during interrogation. Said it quite flatly. They had died under interrogation. Other investigations continue. Now, what is fascinating to me, and what I think we have to look at as a problem here, I mean, one wants to say, well, there's some explanations we can talk about when you talk about the press in Iraq. One, which Michael just brought up, is the kind of shadow of 9/11, the need for patriotism, the fear in some news organizations that they'll be thought, if they report critically, to be unpatriotic. The general spirit of nationalism that followed 9/11, and that certainly covered the run-up to the Iraq War and to the beginning of the war itself. I think you could add to that the mastery of the Bush administration and their ruthlessness in dealing with the press, and Michael mentioned that. Reporters who write things that displease them are frozen out. Now, that isn't unique to the Bush administration, but the Bush administration has done it with a kind of singular discipline and determination and ruthlessness, and I think that's very important. I think we could add a third factor in the recent coverage of the war, which is simply the incredible difficulty right now and danger in covering Iraq. I spoke to a reporter earlier from Time magazine who told me that CBS has been completely paralyzed. They don't go out anymore. They report from their hotel. And this is not the only news organization that is in that, has made that decision about what its reporters will do. Essentially, Westerners represent, when they walk on the street, they look like a pot of gold. If you kidnap this person, you can sell this person to someone who will demand a ransom. So it's become, for that and other reasons, it's become exceedingly difficult to report in Iraq. And the reports you're getting are coming from reporters who are, in large part, confined to their hotels. But I want to get to another point, which I think the issue of the scandal of Abu Ghraib brings up, which is that Abu Ghraib is a story that was reported, I think, quite competently by the American press. The pictures were shown. The pictures gave it great propulsive energy, the story obviously on television. But the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Seymour Hersh, and a number of other publications did extremely well in reporting the story. Yet there was no adjudicatory body to do something with the story. That is, we have a notion that the press's role is to reveal wrongdoing. It is to find out the facts and put them before the public. There then will be institutions of the government, whether in the executive branch, in Congress, or in the judiciary, that will follow up and punish people and expose the wrongdoing and take an adjudicatory role in saying, this is what happened, this is why it's wrong, this is the way you're going to be punished, it won't happen again. And whether we simply have to punish individuals or make changes in the system, this is what we will do. You haven't had that in the Bush administration, mainly because the power to do that is all in the hands of one party. And Abu Ghraib is a great demonstration of this. In April, when these pictures were broadcast, CBS News got them in mid-April. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, called up the head of CBS and said, don't broadcast these. If you broadcast these, it will hurt the war effort. The fighting, as many of you remember, was then going on in Fallujah very brutally. And he was able to persuade CBS to hold them for 2 weeks. They finally did broadcast them. The New Yorker published them a few days later. And it's very clear that officials of the Bush administration sat down and essentially said, this is a scandal that could take us down. This is a scandal that could cost Rumsfeld his job, that could cost high officials their jobs, that could possibly cost the administration the election. How can we handle it? And they did a number of things. They stonewalled an investigation in Congress, which was led by the Armed Services Committee under Senator Warner's chairmanship. He was pushed to stop that investigation, to stop calling witnesses, which he did at the end of the summer. They assigned a number of officers to do investigations into Abu Ghraib, and they did it in a very brilliant way. Abu Ghraib is really a scandal that reaches from the bottom, from military intelligence people who did things like this, and also much more brutal things, including killing prisoners, up through military intelligence officers, the high commanders in Iraq, back to the high command in this country, and finally to the civilians in the Pentagon, and finally, of course, to the office of the president. But the investigations that were undertaken, and the texts of which are included in this book, each of them took only a small part of that chain of responsibility. The first one, the Taguba report, looked at military police, not anything else. The second one, the Fay report, looked at military intelligence. The Schlesinger report looked at several other links about the different investigations. None of them actually looked at this entire chain, which went from what happened on the ground to the policymakers in Washington who made decisions about what could and could not be done in the interrogation rooms. So you had a steady diet of revelations that were fed to the press, but none of them were actually able to pin responsibility on the policymakers who indeed were responsible. And if you read these reports closely, and that is the reason why all of them are included in this book, if you read them closely, it's very clear that the American government, sometime after 9/11, and the couple of months after 9/11, made a series of decisions. One was to withhold Geneva Convention protection from prisoners in Afghanistan, Taliban and Al-Qaeda. A second was to define torture in an extremely broad way. And one of the most interesting documents in this book is a memo written in the Justice Department that was leaked in June that essentially goes after the problem of, well, what does torture mean? We know that there are statutes in the United States against torture. Torture is illegal. We know that the United States has signed international agreements forbidding torture. But what is torture? And this document, which is really kind of a chilling example of bureaucratic evil, I think, and makes remarkable reading, essentially comes up with the formula that torture, to be considered torture, a method of interrogation must cause pain sufficient to cause major bodily injury, major organ failure, or death. Now think of that for a moment. That is a very, very high ceiling. And it allows the kind of things that happened in Abu Ghraib, which amounted to beating prisoners into unconsciousness day after day, to a kind of isolation, particularly repugnant isolation, in very dark rooms, 1 meter by 2 meters long, essentially little boxes, or what the French used to call oubliettes, where they were confined. They were not allowed to move, to stretch out. They were confined in total darkness. You can read about this sorry tale in great depth in these reports themselves, for the American government has investigated it. Now, why has nothing happened? Well, it's not true that nothing happened. Staff Sergeant Ivan Frederick was convicted last week. He pled guilty. He was sentenced to 8 years. And several other of the people you saw in those photographs have pleaded guilty and have been sentenced. But none of the policymakers has resigned. None of them has been indicted. Nobody who decided on the bounds of what activity was legal and what wasn't has received so much as a reprimand. Why is this? Is this the fault of the press? I guess I'm here to argue that it's not, and that there is a certain point where you go from an issue of information, of what you tell the public, to an issue of politics, of what the public is willing to do. And as we sit here now, 8 days before the election, it seems to me that that's where we stand. I came to political consciousness under Watergate. I remember watching when I was 14 or 13, I think, the Watergate hearings on television. I remember it very vividly. And the notion of the press as an institution that goes out and reveals wrongdoing, and that wrongdoing will then be corrected by other organs of the government, in that case the Congress, is deeply instilled in me. We don't have that system today. We now have a polity that has seen this kind of wrongdoing, from weapons of mass destruction to Abu Ghraib, can read about it in these reports. They're all on the internet, they're in this book, and yet the wrongdoing stays. Nothing has been done to punish it. So you reach the point where it's not information, it's politics. It's funny, I felt myself, I have to confess, Michael and I have made appearances together a number of times this week, and I feel myself, when he's talking about the press and making criticisms with which I'm deeply sympathetic, I also find myself growing somewhat protective, because I think, though the press did a particularly terrible job in the lead up to the war, that the sickness that our society is experiencing now, in the end, can't be traced to the press, that it has to be traced to the larger political world. And I think that the scandals that we're discussing tonight, in the end, have their solution, I'm afraid, in politics. We have now seen the coverage improve, and I think Michael would agree with this, in the last couple of months, largely because you have had a voice in opposition. The first press conference in which George Bush was actually given a hard time, at least in my opinion, he may disagree, was the press conference in which President Alawi, Prime Minister Alawi, came over and joined President Bush in the Rose Garden. And for the first time, the press stood up and actually asked some very hard, very difficult questions and challenged President Bush. In fact, he got this look on his face very similar to the look that all of you remember from the first debate, as in, what's happening here? Who are you guys? And I think the reason for that is that John Kerry, finally, in the week preceding that press conference, had started to make Iraq the issue. He had started to challenge him aggressively on Iraq. What we've seen over the last few years is what happens to a press in a country that is seized by nationalism, in which there is very little political opposition. And what we've looked at has not been pretty. It's been very ugly. But the sources in the end, it seems to me, do not lie entirely with the press itself. Now, I'll let us go on to Bob, but I want to say one other thing. Orville asked, why is the New York Review different? And one obvious answer is Robert Silvers, who is the greatest editor in the country, I think, without any competitors. For me, what makes the New York Review different is it's a place where I can write what I want, essentially when I want to write it. And it has an editor who is willing to call up and say, I tend to talk to Bob when I'm in California I call up at 11 o'clock when he's still in his office at 2 in the morning, and we'll have a conversation about Abu Ghraib. And he will say things to me like, the revelation is really the scandal. The way these reports have been issued, that is the scandal. We're in the scandal now. And he will say this in such a way that I will start to look at this issue in an entirely different frame of mind. And that, to me, is what a great editor does. So the answer to the question of why the New York Review is different is simply sitting on stage with us, I think. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more as well. Thanks.
Well, Bob, you are indeed a great editor, but yourself apart. Perhaps you could help us understand how is it that the New York Review of Books can be different?
Well, I first want to say that it's a particular pleasure to be here in Berkeley, where we've had so many contributors and so many readers, where I hardly ever am, and to be here with Orville, who's written for us over the years, and our two contributors who've produced these books that we're so happy to have published. And the question is, well, how did we get into this? How did we get into a situation where these books emerged, these articles emerged? And I was thinking that was crucial in doing that was a piece we published back in September 26, 2002. It was a piece by Frankie Fitzgerald, one of our old contributors, used to be right on the Vietnam War. And it examined in detail a major split that was happening then in American politics and American life. And it was based upon a rather brief moment when Ben Scowcroft was willing to talk about the differences between the elements that he represented in the Bush senior administration and the people who were dominating policy in the new administration. And in this article by Frankie Fitzgerald, he talked very specifically about Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Cheney, and their neoconservative allies, Richard Perot, Paul Wolfowitz, and Douglas Feith, and their attitudes particularly toward Iraq and Israel. And Frankie showed, based on her conversations and also her reporting, that a number of these advisors, officials, had during the 1990s evolved a position, some of them having worked as advisors or been advisors to the Israeli government. Richard Perot, for example, had written papers of counsel to the government there, and the essence of this policy was that a settlement in the Middle East, an American interest in the Middle East, depended on the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in view of the threats posed by his weapons of mass destruction. And Frankie brought out that this was not just a larger policy position, which had to do, for example, with approval of preventative war, with discarding and annulment of major treaties, but with a very specific determination to get rid of a regime that had a direct bearing on American policy in the Middle East, and particularly the future of Israel and the possibility of a settlement there. Now, that was for us at the Review a revelatory piece, and in a few months we were able to publish another article, this one by Elizabeth Drew, on these very neoconservative officials. And what came out of that article was that they, in their determination to do something about Saddam Hussein and Iraq and the Middle East and Israel, had become to depend for some time on the advice of Ahmed Chalabi and his group of exiles. Now, these two articles put us on a kind of alert, because over the years we'd come to know some of the New York Times reporters who were doing these articles on Iraq and on weapons of mass destruction. And we knew they had long acquaintanceship with the very group that Frankie had identified as dominant in foreign policy in the government. And so it was something that we felt should be looked into. And suddenly, in the spring of that year, there was an extraordinary article in the Washington Post, an article which was one of the most combustive I can remember, although it may not now be so remembered. It said that the writer had come into possession of an email exchange between Judith Miller, one of the very reporters we were so aware of on the New York Times, and the New York Times bureau chief in Baghdad, John Burns. And John Burns had objected to some of the reports of Judy Miller, which had depended upon the views, the information of Ahmed Chalabi. And he objected to it. And she in her email, her private email, said, and I had the quiz, a very interesting quote. She said, most of the papers, front page exclusives, and weapons of mass destruction, she wrote to him, had come from Chalabi. Now, she later said that she exaggerated that claim. But we knew that that Chalabi was so influential because, among other things, in the article by Elizabeth Drew, she had shown and had talked to Richard Pearl. And he said, you know, I've known him a long time, and I think I'm probably responsible for having made him so important, because I introduced him, having known him so long, I introduced him to the others. So we had this chain of information in our own articles, and they weren't the only articles that were pointing toward this dominance of this group or to the raison d'etre of weapons of mass destruction, but we thought they were revelatory articles because they were saying something that hadn't been said. Now, when the article appeared in the Washington Post, in which Judy Miller said that most of our important stories on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq had come from Mr. Chalabi, in the light of the other things we'd been doing, it seemed that it was time for a full inquiry into what was happening at the New York Times. Now, we were very lucky at this point because Michael Massing had been writing for us for years, and in fact, he recently had been writing about the coverage of the Iraq War. He went there to the U.S. Command headquarters in Qatar, and he revealed some things that we had not seen anyone else reveal. He'd shown, for example, how the system of embedding reporters had led to rather severe restrictions on the ability of those reporters to write openly and fully about the things they had seen and about the, shall we say, the gaps and errors and faults in the conduct of the war. And he did something else. He was able to look at the coverage of the war by other journalists from other countries, from the British and the BBC. And he showed that the coverage from other countries was radically different from the kind of thing we were getting on our networks and on new cable news programs. There was a whole range of information that we were not getting. Just to take an example, I think if you have been watching the news for all these years, I doubt any of you have seen an American soldier being shot and dying, or an American soldier being badly wounded. There's footage of those things, and it's shown in other countries, but we don't see it. Anyway, Michael Massing is one of the most acute critics of the press in the post-war years. And he was keen to look into this question that had been now exposed in the Washington Post and very seriously implied in the articles we published. And he was able to explore why there had been this protective and indeed very misleading nexus between Mr. Shalaby and a government strategy that was hardly exposed, hardly put across with any honesty to the public. Now, one result of that work of Michael was what I take to be a journalistic miracle, which is that the New York Times apologized twice. And as Michael has just said, we've seen since that apology something like what the Chinese used to call a campaign of rectification. That is to say, big front-page articles, some of them by the very people like Michael Gordon, who had participated in the very same emphasis that Michael called attention to. And I should say also that Michael did something that I thought was also unusual. He found that certain people, such as the physicist David Albright, had been insistently challenging the administration view of weapons of mass destruction as an expert. And he was able to show how he had been interviewed and disregarded, how he had been popular on television talk shows until he challenged the conventional wisdom of the administration and then dropped. And he showed finally that it was possible to have really a highly informed critical view of these events, because he had, in his reading of the press, he had found that the Knight Ridder chain of papers, with their Washington bureau, had persistently and consistently skeptically challenged many of the administration's conclusions about weapons of mass destruction, about aluminum tubes, about yellow cake, and that this bureau had found in the bureaucracy people who were willing to talk. Unfortunately, the Knight Ridder newspapers have no outlet either in Washington or New York. And so many of their revelations simply were not circulated. And that itself is a kind of comment on how journalism works. But he found it, and there was a rectification, and there's not the slightest reason for anyone to relax any kind of scrutiny, but it was I think, unprecedented series of inquiries that he conducted, and they had a most amazing effect. Now, I cannot say the same for the extraordinary work that Mark has done. Because after Cy Hirsch was able to get those photographs, those appalling, sinister photographs of Abu Ghraib, there was indeed just exactly the series of reports that he has described, covering one aspect of this use of torture and another. But whatever the final way may be to get at this hideous problem, there's something is deeply lacking. What we have really is a caricature of an appalling situation. The caricature is in the photographs. The photographs are of low-level personnel administering hideous treatment. And they have been the subject of low-level prosecution. Now, at the very same time, there are literally hundreds of people for whom the American government feels it is entirely legitimate to administer pain, severe pain, and even death. And so far, the press has not been able to fully and adequately describe how that is going on right now and what is being done about it. So, and I'm sure Mark is right, that the ultimate solution for such a problem is a political one. But it is a political one in which I feel, as with so many other political questions, what the press can do is indispensable. So there is a huge, I believe, challenge, and what is, if anything, one feels awfully skeptical about how it will be met, except in the two cases of the reporters here tonight. So I'm very grateful to them.